Good evening, everybody. It's Lorraine, Alternative Homesteading. Actually, it is very, very early on Saturday morning. I hope everybody's doing well. I'm going to continue reading from the John Hall Guinea Pigs Technologies of Control book. I'm not doing it in any particular sequence, so I started off yesterday with the introduction and a little bit on Chapter 1. I'm going to skip to Chapter 6 on organized stalking. But before I do, please hit the thumbs up. This is Lorraine, Alternative Homesteading. Hope everybody's doing well. Had a good day today. Welcome newcomers. Welcome to my channel. Hope you're here to learn about homesteading, community-based harassment, watch-listed people, targeting, etc., etc. Anybody that wants to email me, you can email me at alternativehomesteading@gmail.com. And I look forward to your questions and comments. And you can also send me links there or interesting articles that you might want me to discuss on the channel. I will say that I do not discuss religion. I don't get into that topic. I don't have a lot of background on it. I don't want to discuss it. To get a strike or whatever. And I'm really not that into politics, although obviously what we are discussing here involves politics, but I'm not very politically adept, and I don't really have much interest in politics. But, okay, so we're going to get on to Organized Stalking, Chapter 6, and this is a quote from Luke 20:20. Keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretended to be honest. In January 2008, the U.S. Department of Justice, DOJ, publicized its survey, quote, Stalking Victimization in the United States, unquote. The results were alarming! Exclamation mark. Complaints of stalking, legitimate enough to be included in the study, were exponentially from the previous survey done in 1996. An estimated 3.4 million people were victims of stalking, while another 2.4 were victims of harassment. The study covers victimization occurring in 2005 and the first half of 2006, and inquired about events in the previous 12 months. 6% of the 5.8 million total suffered electronic monitoring, such as spyware, bugging, or video surveillance. While many of the victims were stalked by someone they were acquainted with, 1 in 10 victims were stalked and harassed by people unknown to them. The study defines stalking as a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Approximately 130,000 victims reported that they were fired or asked to leave their jobs because of stalking. Another study published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine in 2006 found that 7 million women and 2 million men in the United States have been stalked. The study was from the National Center for Injury Prevention and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Now I'm just going to add, folks, a lot of people who are stalked never report it. So these statistics are not indicative of the true volume of stalking incidences. And of course, when targeted people report it to the local police department, they don't do anything about it. They won't even write the word stalked on the incident report. It also found that individuals who were never married, separated, divorced, or widowed, or divorced experienced significantly higher rates of stalking than those individuals living with a partner. I mean, this makes sense, right? These criminals love to isolate the victim, and if you're alone, you're easy prey for these losers. Because, you know what? They're a bunch of losers against one innocent person, and when there are two people, the second person can validate the experience of the first individual and also be a witness. They don't like that. A 2002 study found no gender differences in the mental health effects of stalking. Both male and female victims experienced equal rates of impaired health, depression, and injury, and were more likely to engage in substance abuse than their non-stalked peers. A common theme among several of the stalking studies was the inability of the victims to get appropriate help from law enforcement officials. Surprise, surprise! I'll repeat that again. A common theme among several of the stalking studies was the inability of the victims to get appropriate help from law enforcement officials. Despite the anti-stalking laws in just about every state, victims that report stalkers are often disregarded by their local police department as quote-unquote head cases, even when you have evidence, or suffering from the delusion of being stalked. Prosecution rates bear out this fact. Between 85.4% and 93.6% of stalking perpetrators are not prosecuted, and only 56.3% of those convicted are sentenced to jail. This is alarming. Moreover, the 2008 DOJ study reported that the most common police response to the stalking complaints was to take a report, while in 20% of the cases, no action was taken at all. I can confirm that to be a fact. About 50% of victims perceived no change in the stalking or harassment after police were contacted. Yep. Obviously, we have a growing problem with stalking and harassment in the country based upon several governmental studies. However, I would propose that the problem is compounded by the lack of appropriate law enforcement engagement at the local level. This may be due to several factors. 1, the reporting officer's perception of the victim as mentally ill for believing that they're being stalked. 2, ignorance on part of local law enforcement as to the extent of the problem. 3, difficulty in obtaining enough evidence to justify an arrest. I don't have that problem, folks. And I know some of you don't either. 4, knowledge on part of law enforcement officials as to the difficulty in prosecuting stalking cases. 5, unwillingness to dedicate the manpower needed to investigate what they perceive as a low-level crime. Yeah, they look at it as a low-level crime. I'm just going to add that, what does stalking involve? Stalking involves the surveillance and watching of someone as an addiction, as a compulsion, as an obsession. It's an invasion of privacy, right? Very often it is the trespassing of your property. Sometimes it is the entering of a residence to install equipment to further watch that individual, contacting the individual's friends and family. And that is not significant enough for law enforcement to be on it. I'm sure if it were happening to one of their kids, they'd be all over it. If it was happening to one of their wives or a parent, it wouldn't be a problem for them. But when somebody else reports it, it's inconsequential. Oh, they're delusional. Even with the evidence. Armed with some basic statistics in hand, we can now turn our attention to a very specific form of stalking. Many of the victims of auditory harassment also complain of a form of stalking referred to as, quote-unquote, organized stalking, gang stalking, or cause stalking. I prefer the term organized stalking as it more accurately reflects the true nature of the phenomenon. Organized stalking is the harassment of an individual by people unknown to them for the sole purpose of inducing psychological trauma. You hear that? The sole purpose is it to induce psychological trauma. It is perpetuated by individuals from within their community working in concert with each other to achieve a desired goal and is centrally directed and organized. Oh, they have a goal. The Little Loser Club has a goal. Well, we all have a goal too. To expose them, one loser at a time. Gang stalking is a term often used for this phenomenon. However, it is misleading in that it invokes a mental picture of thugs in matching jackets perpetuating the crime. This is not the case. Cause stalking, a term coined by author David Lawson in his similarly titled book, implies a racial or social agenda on part of the perpetrators. Again, this has not been shown to be an accurate term according to victim demographics. Surveys conducted by the human rights organization Freedom from Covert Harassment and Surveillance have demonstrated a relatively random distribution of victims of this crime. There appears to be no increased predilection based upon race, religion, profession, or culture. The only two common threads among the reported victims are female gender and a high incidence of sexual assault facilitated with date rape drugs such as Rofinol or GHB. A large number of male victims have also reported being raped after surreptitiously ingesting date rape drugs. Those sexual assaults go largely unprosecuted due to the amnesiac effects of the various date rape drugs. Let me turn the page. As well as the narrow window of opportunity to detect them in the urine of the victim. Organized stalking consists of a complex myriad of actions on part of the perpetrator that has undoubtedly contributed to the rise in complaints reported to the DOJ. The problem has become so pervasive that a multitude of websites have arisen to educate and console a growing number of victims. Eleanor White has been battling the organized stalking phenomenon longer than anyone. Her website, www.raven1.net, is both educational and current in its content. Gangstalkingworld.com is another excellent website providing educational articles for those who suspect they may be victims of this cowardly crime. Some of the antics associated with organized stalking include 1. Following the targeted individual 24/7 wherever they travel. 2. Loitering around their home or business they frequent. 3. Breaking into the target's home, usually to vandalize it and rummage through their belongings, with rare property theft. Oh yeah, rare. That's not true. 4. Harassing the victim with profanity or vulgar gestures while in public places. And 5. Character assassination of the victim through spreading rumors about them to neighbors and employers. And 6. Damage to a victim's vehicles or personal property. 7. Bombard the victim with loud noises around the home or work. The perpetrators will often enlist the help of the victim's neighbors by convincing them that they are some form of legitimate law enforcement. In several instances, the perpetrators have produced false FBI credentials to convince neighbors that they are assisting in a legitimate investigation. Often, vacant homes or apartments around the victim will be used as a base of which to terrorize the intended target. The stalking protocol by the perpetrators is not to be confused as actual surveillance. It is warfare. The stalking is intended to induce psychological stress, alienate the victim, isolate the victim, and maintain them in a perpetual state of helplessness or victim mentality. The complaint of this type of stalking to law enforcement is often met with targeted. Let's see. Okay, 7. Bombard the victim with loud noises around the home or work, and the perpetrators will often enlist the help of victims' neighbors by convincing them that they are some form of legitimate law enforcement. Oh yeah, the fake badge. Fake plastic badges. In several instances, the perpetrators have produced false FBI credentials. My favorite Bureau of Investigation. To convince neighbors that they are assisting in a legitimate investigation. Often, vacant homes or apartments around the victim will be used as a base from which to terrorize the intended target. The stalking protocol used by the perpetrators is not to be confused as actual surveillance. It is simply a harassment tool used in a form of psychological warfare. The stalking is intended to induce psychological stress, alienate the victim, isolate the victim, and maintain them in a perpetual state of helplessness or victim mentality. The complaint of this type of stalking to law enforcement is often ignored, or the victim is referred to a mental health professional. Yeah, because they know what's going on. They're involved in it, and they're protecting these criminals, these stalkers. The psychiatric community, being ill-educated on this topic, invariably diagnoses the victim with schizophrenia or delusional disorder. The eventual discreditation of the victim through the diagnosis of a mental disorder is probably the ultimate intended goal of the perpetrators. This type of stalking is not a new phenomenon and gets its roots from an FBI operation called COINTELPRO. I know at least a dozen targeted women that this has happened to, including myself. When I lived at 52 Sutton Drive in Manalapan, New Jersey, the criminals at the Manalapan Police Department called me telling me that they were going to provide me a property loss statement. Instead, they brought me the fraudulent Tina Booth, and they broke into my house after I showed them evidence of vandalism. They ignored it. Yes, they did. So between 1956 and 1971, the FBI directed a number of covert, I just found a typographical error, operations known as COINTELPRO, an acronym for Counterintelligence Program. Their goal was to infiltrate and subvert certain social and political groups that were deemed as a threat to national security. I'm so tired of hearing that, folks. Are you? A threat to national security? They're the threat to national security. The directives governing COINTELPRO were issued by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and were designed to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and neutralize the activities of the targeted groups and their leaders. Some of the groups included communist organizations, women rights groups, black nationalists, civil rights organizations, the NAACP, the American Indian Movement, and the KKK. The methods employed by the FBI are identical to those being used today by organized stalking groups. They include public character assassination, harassment through legal and financial institutions, conspicuous surveillance, illegal breaking and entering, psychological operations, vandalism, and assault. Harassment is often through the manipulation of employers, parents, neighbors, and landlords to assist in the victimization of the intended target. COINTELPRO remains secret until 1971, when an FBI field office was broken into and documents relating to COINTELPRO operations were leaked to the press. In 1976, an investigation was launched by the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities of the United States Senate. It was chaired by Senator Frank Church and is referred to as the Church Committee hearings. The final report of the Church Committee essentially found the FBI guilty. No! They found the FBI guilty of vigilante operations aimed squarely at preventing the exercise of First Amendment rights of speech and association. Wow. That's 1976, and they're still at it, folks. Still at it. Unsavory and victims' tactics have been employed, including anonymous attempts to break up marriages, disrupt meetings, estrange persons from their professions, and provoke target groups into rivalries that might result in deaths. But this is really sinister. These tactics are identical to the ones being used by organized stalking groups today. So the question remains, is organized stalking a continuation of COINTELPRO or merely a replication of its tactics by criminal groups? My personal belief is that it is a combination of both hypotheses. Certainly, there are several cases I am aware of where the former intelligence agencies' employees are being directly harassed by their former employers in a COINTELPRO fashion. However, most victims of organized stalking are not whistleblowers or former intelligence agency employees that would awaken the ire of the intelligence community. The majority of victims are citizens with no ties to radical groups. However, the identification of one of the stalking groups in Texas leads me to believe that this phenomenon is a combination of COINTELPRO training and replication of the tactics by criminals. The organization identified in San Antonio, Texas as quote-unquote hiring out this type of harassment is licensed as a private investigative agency. The agency is owned by former FBI agent in his 70s who would have been in his prime as an FBI agent during COINTELPRO. His employees, however, are not connected to any particular government agency and are simply licensed private investigators. Despite multiple complaints to the Texas Department of Public Safety, the licensing agency for private investigators, this group continues to victimize people in Texas uninhibitedly. Many former FBI agents turn to private industry and private investigative work after separating from the agency, and this may be the mode of networking among the variety of stalking groups from state to state. When one analyzes the complaints being voiced by victims of organized stalking from each state, striking similarities are very apparent. All of the victims are experiencing stalking, break-ins, appliance tampering, and remote neural monitoring. The stalking groups are obviously networking with each other or following a template of proven successful tactics. Networking among these organized stalking groups would also explain the continuation of a victim suffering even after moving to another state to escape their torment. Yep. It's actually a little worse here in Kentucky. Victims who relocate hoping to end their stalking usually report 2 to 3 months of relief before the harassment resumes in their new geographic location. While the idea of multiple COINTELPRO trained agents scattered over the United States seems far-fetched at first, one need look no farther Then to the new alarming trend within the intelligence agencies. We will cover the role that private intelligence contractors possibly play in this phenomenon in a later chapter. Private intelligence contractors, folks. Private detectives, private contractors, surveillance role players. But these private intelligence contractors, they're very often retired law enforcement, military, InfraGard. These are the private intelligence contractors. They have security clearances and they know how to break into a home. So that is the end of chapter 6, folks. I look forward to your questions, comments down below. Again, this is a reading from John Hall's Guinea Pigs, Technologies of Control. And I'll show you right here. And this is the end of chapter 6. I hope everybody's doing well. I'm going to sign off for now. And we'll talk to you soon.